What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to show you how to do your outside pre-trip inspection. This is a 2012 International 8600. It only has one axle in the back. We're going to start with the front and then do both sides of the engine compartment, and then we're going to move down the driver's side as soon as we get to that point. If it's unique to the passenger side, you're going to inspect those parts also. So starting with the front, I'm going to check my ID marker lights. There's 5 of them, 3 in the middle and 2 on the sides. They're amber in color. They are properly mounted secure. They're not broken, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. Next, I'm going to move down to my headlight assembly. I'm going to check my headlight assembly, making sure it is properly mounted secure. It's not broken, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. It's clean and clear. These serve as my high and low beams. I also have an amber color light on the side. That one serves as my left and right indicator, my running light, and my four-way flashers or emergency light. And I also have an amber color reflector on the side. Now we're going to move under the vehicle, checking to make sure that there's no fresh puddling, no kind of leaking, oil or coolant, hydraulic fluid for fuel leaks. I have no leaks. I'm also going to make sure that I have no hoses or cables dangling, that everything is properly tucked under the vehicle. Now we're going to go ahead and move to the passenger side of the engine. Now from here, passenger side of the engine, I'm going to do a general overview of all my cables and hoses, making sure they are all properly mounted secure, they're not broken, loose, or missing, all the hardware is present. I'm going to make sure that all of my hoses are not cut, ripped, or torn. They're all properly mounted secure, they're not leaking any kind of fluid or air pressure. I don't hear any air leaks. I'm also going to check to make sure any of my cables or all my cables are all properly mounted secure, they're not cut, ripped, torn, grounding, there's no exposed wire or excess electrical tape. Now I'm going to get into specifics, starting with my coolant reservoir. I'm going to make sure it is properly mounted secure, it's not broken, loose, or missing, all hardware is present. It is not cracked, broken, or leaking any kind of fluid. All the hoses coming to and from the coolant reservoir are also properly mounted secure. They're not broke, loose, or missing. They're not cracked or dry rotted. They're not leaking any kind of fluid. They're all in good working condition. My coolant reservoir is also clear, so I could check the level. So if I needed to add more, I'd remove the cap, fill it to the proper level, make sure the cap is all nice and tight when I'm done. From there, I'm going to move on to the washer fluid reservoir. Some of them have a bigger washer fluid reservoir down here. Mine is right here. It's small. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. It is not cracked or leaking any kind of fluid. It is clear, so I could check the level. So if I needed to add more, remove the cap, fill it to the proper level, make sure the cap is all nice and tight once I'm done. I do not care about these hoses here. Next, I'm going to move to the exhaust since we're on this side. From here, I'm going to go ahead and check the exhaust and start from the turbo and follow it all the way back. Be sure not to get stuck at the turbo. Just follow it all the way back, making sure it is all properly mounted secure, not broke, loose, or missing, all hardware is present. You're going to make sure all the clamps and brackets, mounting brackets, are all properly mounted secure. They're not cracked or broken, they're not loose, they're not missing. There's no signs of black smoke that would indicate a loose or cracked or broken exhaust. The only place that should have black smoke is at the tip of the pipe. I'm going to move to the heat shield on my exhaust, making sure it is properly mounted secure, it's not broke, loose, or missing, all the hardware is present. It's not cracked or broken in any way, it's in good working condition. I will ask the examiner for permission to move on to the driver's side of the engine bay. From here, we're going to do the same. We're going to check all the cables and hoses as we did on that side. That's all I'm going to mention to him. And then from there, after you told him you're going to check your cables and hoses, you're going to move to the oil dipstick. Now you're welcome to check everything any way, any kind of flow that you feel like, as long as you make sure that you check everything that's said on this video. I like to start with my oil dipstick because it's right here and it's just in the front and in the way. So I'm going to make sure it is properly mounted secure, it's not broke, loose, or missing, all the hardware is present. The way I would check my oil is I'll pull it out, wipe it clean, reinsert it, pull it back out and make sure it's between add and full, or make sure it's at the proper level. You could say both ways. You don't physically have to do it. You just have to explain how you're going to check it. Now, if I needed to add more, I'd fill it 1 gallon at a time right here at the oil fill cap, and then recheck as needed. So fill it 1 gallon at a time and recheck as needed. Once I have enough, I'll make sure everything is properly mounted and secure and in good working condition once I'm done. Now I'm going to move to the back of the engine compartment, and from this angle you can't really see, but it is back here. I'm going to check the air compressor. I'm going to make sure that the air compressor is properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. It is not cracked or broken or leaking any air. It is in good working condition. I'm also going to mention that it is gear driven. Now you have to say gear driven, otherwise you will not get the point. Next, below that is the power steering pump. I'm going to make sure that the power steering pump is also properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. It does carry liquid, so I'm going to make sure it's not cracked or broken or leaking any kind of fluids. Right? That item is also gear driven. You also have to mention it is running on the gears of the engine. It is gear driven. Now I'm going to move to the alternator, which is located right behind the oil fill pipe right here. The alternator is properly mounted and secure. It is not broke, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. It is not cracked or broken in any way. The cable connection is also properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. That cable is not cut, ripped, torn. There's no exposed wire or excess electrical tape. That item is belt driven. Now directly below that, the first pulley directly below the alternator is the water pump. The water pump is properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. It's not cracked or leaking. It has fluid. It carries fluid in it, so I'm going to make sure it's not cracked or leaking any kind of fluid. And it is also belt driven. Now we'll go ahead and move into the serpentine belt, making sure that that is properly mounted and secure. I'm going to make sure it's not dry rotted, cracked. It's not broken. It's not loose. It's not missing. It has no more than 3/4 inches of play if I push or pull on the serpentine belt. Now I'm going to start to move out, starting with my frame. So there, I'm going to check my frame, making sure it is properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. That item, I'm going to make sure that it is 2 pieces that run the length of the vehicle, and it does not have any illegal holes or illegal welds. So there's 2 items that have illegal holes or illegal welds that we're going to make sure of. That's one of them. Now I'm going to move out a little bit more, checking my gearbox. I'm going to make sure my gearbox is properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. It is not cracked or broken or leaking any kind of power steering fluid. Right. I'm going to make sure all the hoses on my gearbox or my power steering hoses are all properly mounted and secure. They're not broken, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. Those hoses are not cut. They're not cut, ripped, or torn. They're not dry rotted or cracked, and they are not leaking any kind of fluid. I'm going to check my steering column, and this truck has 2 universal joints, one on the back and one back here and one on the front. So I'm going to make sure all 3 of those are properly mounted and secure. They're not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. The steering column is not bent or cracked in any way. Those universal joints are properly greased. They're not worn out. They're in good working condition. Now we're going to move on to the suspension, and I have a spring mount back here. I got a leaf spring. I got 2 U-bolts, and in the back it's a spring hanger. It's not a spring mount. So I'm going to make sure that those are all properly mounted and secure. They're not broke, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. My leaf springs aren't shifted or scissoring, right? They're not cracked or broken anyway. Everything's in good working condition. I also have a shock absorber, which is also part of the suspension. I'm going to make sure that's properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. It is not cracked or leaking any kind of hydraulic fluid, so it's in good working condition. Now I'm going to move to my steering linkage, starting with my pitman arm. I got a drag link. I got an upper and lower steering knuckle and a tie rod and a tie rod arm. I'm going to make sure that all those items are properly mounted and secure. They're not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. They all have castle nuts with cotter pins in place. They all have ball joints and bushings, which are also properly mounted and secure. They're not worn out in any way. They're properly mounted and secure, not broke, loose, or missing. They are in good working condition. Now we're going to move to the brake system, starting with the brake hose. I'm going to make sure the brake hose is properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. It's not dry rotted or cracked in any way. It's not cut. It's not leaking any air. I don't hear no air leaks coming out of it. Next is the brake line. This is the ABS line, which is an electrical line. I'm going to make sure that one is properly mounted and secure. It's not broke, loose, or missing. All hardware is present. That cable connection is not cut, grounding, excess electrical tape, or exposed wire on it. It's in good working condition. I'm going to check my brake chamber with the C-clamp. I'm going to make sure those are both properly mounted and secure. They're not broke, loose, or missing. All the hardware is present. It's not cracked or bent or damaged in any way. Now I'm going to move on to my push rod and my slack adjuster. I'm going to make sure my push rod and slack adjuster are both properly mounted secure. They're not broke, loose, and missing. All the hardware is present. They're not cracked or broken in any way. And I'm going to make sure I have no more than 1 inch of play on this push rod on the front. Right. The way I would check that I have no more than 1 inch play is I'm going to chock my wheels, release the parking brake, mark it, then I'll pull on this and make sure that I have no more than 1 inch of play when I pull on it. Next, I'm going to move in here and check the brake lining and the brake drum. I'm going to make sure that the brake lining and the brake drum are properly mounted secure. They're not broke, loose, missing. All hardware is present. I'm going to make sure there's no grease or oil in between the brake drum and the brake lining or the brake shoes. Right? I'm going to make sure the pads on my brake lining have no less than 1/4 inch of meat on them. I'm going to make sure they're not cracked or broken in any way. I'm also going to make sure that my drum is not cracked or bent or damaged in any way. There's no signs of bluing, which would indicate overheating on my brakes. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to my rims and tires. For the rims and tires, I'm going to mention the inner and outer of the rim, making sure that I'm going to check the inner and outer part of it, make sure my rim is properly mounted secure, it's not broke, loose, missing, all hardware is present. I'm going to make sure that it is true and round. There's no excess hammering on my rim, right? There's no hammering on it. There's no illegal holes or illegal welds. This is item number 2. I'm going to make sure there's no illegal holes or illegal welds on my rim. I'm going to move to the tire and make sure that my tire on the inner and outer wall are beaded to the rim nicely. I'm going to move to the tire and check to make sure that the inner and outer walls of the tires have no abrasions, bubbles, or cuts. They're not damaged in any way, and I hear no air leaks coming out of the tire. I'm going to make sure that this tire is worn evenly. Right? There's no gouges or chunks missing on the tire. Making sure that there's no less than 4/32 on the front tires of tread. 4/32 of an inch on the front tires. Right? I'm going to make sure that these tires have between 90 and 110 psi or whatever the manufacturer specifications are for this tire. I repeat myself. I'm going to make sure these tires have 90 to 110 or whatever it says on the sidewall. Next, I'm going to move to my lug nuts, making sure that they are properly mounted secure. They're not broke, loose, missing. All hardware is present. There's no shiny metal behind the lug nut, and there's no rust streaks that would indicate a loose nut or a broken stud. Right? They are all properly mounted secure, not broke, loose, missing. All hardware is present. They are in good working condition. I'm going to move to the valve stem, making sure that it is properly mounted secure, not broke, loose, missing. All hardware is present. It is not rubbing against the rim. It's not bent or broken or damaged, and I don't hear any air leaks coming out of it, and I do have a metal cap on it. Now I'm going to go ahead and check the oil hub, making sure it is properly mounted secure. It's not broke, loose, missing. All hardware is present. There's no signs of leaking. It is in good working condition. It is clean and clear, so I can see the level. Even though it looks dark, it is clear, so I can see the level. I'm going to make sure that I have enough fluid in there. But if I don't, what I'll do is I'll remove the cap, put my pinky in, and it should go up to the first knuckle. If it needs more fluid, I'll go ahead and fill it and make sure the cap is on nice and tight once I'm done. Usually at this point, they'll cut you off at the DMV. That's where Form A ends.